thinks about kind of civic engagement and is very kind of attuned to these issues. But I mean, to David's point, what we try to do is to both, I hate the term, but marry people's public opinions, right? Their sense of their experience with secondary data that either supported their understanding of what was happening or sometimes refuted. But I think one of the things that we heard repeatedly, in particular from Latinx, Asian American, and African American young people, was that a real sense that there was unfairness in the ways in which educational resources were distributed throughout the city. And if you look in the report, one of the things we suggest is, although white youth represent only 10% of those young people in CPS, they are overwhelmingly represented in the selective enrollment schools, right? So the places where, in fact, the city has identified that you will get an exceptional education are overrepresented with whites. So we can have that secondary data, but what we can also hear are the experiences and the quotes of young people who say, what does that mean for me? Mm-hmm. So for some young people, it means I don't have access to quality education. For other young people, in particular, for example, in Asian American communities, they say, I have to go out of my neighborhood. So I might get into the school, but it means I've got to travel for maybe an hour, maybe a half an hour. I feel, a bit more alienated when I come back to my neighborhood. Right. And they ask the question of, why does that have to be? So the secondary data, I would argue, is critically important, but it's really hearing the voices of young people to contextualize that data, to say what it means in terms of my life and how I experience that inequality. That is kind of what we're trying to do with the report.
One of the takeaways that I got from this section, it showed that a lot of, from like the testimonials of different people and their different experiences, despite the fact that a lot of white young adults were removed from a lot of those experiences that other young adults in Chicago had. They all had very similar visions for education in the city. Mm-hmm. So this is kind of maybe applies to, different findings from the report, but did that make you feel like there is some sort of hope or some sort of alignment that young adults in Chicago have, despite the fact that the experiences are so varied?
Yeah, I mean, I do think that there is a lot of, not just potential, but there's active coalition building and maintaining around, what is around equity, racial equity, socioeconomic equity in the city. And, in many ways, it's a clear vision, too, about sort of equal funding, equitable funding. And I think that the work of this report just underlines that work that is continuing to happen on the ground.
Can I say this? So it's been interesting, exactly what you said. We hear young people across race and ethnicity saying, look, education, the way in which we distribute educational resources is just wrong. Now, I'm going to benefit, some people will say, but it's wrong. It's amazing to see the kind of the clearness of vision of inequity among young people. And then, for example, to hear the outgoing mayor at this moment talking about all the victories around education, right? And I just think that there's I dare say, moral clarity that comes out in the report from young people, even those who are benefiting from an unequal system, saying something is wrong here. So I do think I take that as a kind of hopeful note. The question is, hope is nice, but unless we have an infrastructure that can actually kind of mobilize and organize people around their understanding of inequity, then it doesn't take us very far. And I think that's the kind of exciting and the promising part of the report, which is to say, okay, based with this information, how do we move that insight forward?
So maybe we can shift now to another section of the Race and Place report on policing and violence. Just to contextualize, this report is full of some very moving excerpts from interviews and conversations that you had with the young people around the city that you interviewed. And I was wondering if you could read this excerpt that's on this handout you gave us on police and violence.
Oh, the one here from Jada?
Yes.
Okay, so Jada is that is a pseudonym, and she's 22 years old, African American woman in Inglewood, and she's one of many who talked about who was impacted by the inappropriate response of police officers to domestic abuse, and as she said in an interview we had with her, quote, "I had an issue with my son. I was in an abusive relationship. I called the cops 5 times to remove my son's father from my house, and instead of taking him out, they flipped to make it seem like I was the bad person. Literally, I just got hit, and the police did not say anything about that.
What can police in Chicago and across the United States in general do to mitigate these sentiments that are very valid about their unresponsiveness to people of color in predominantly under-resourced neighborhoods?
Great. So first of all, I'd say, like, for example, you had Trina here before, and she's really an expert on this.
Trina Tyler is one of our classmates here at the Harris School.
She is a major expert on this and is doing really, really important work around this in the city. And so, I think that we have had, decades of, sort of law and order, intense policing in the city and around the country. And many people, go to meetings and they talk about, there's these issues in the neighborhood, and the police are a go-to because in many ways the state has stepped back from providing support. So I think many people think about the police as an institution that handles a range of issues, including, the issue exactly that Jada talked about here. But one thing that is very clear from what young people in the report, young adults in the report said, is that the police are, not always an appropriate resource when around certain issues. And in fact, calling the police can really exacerbate, make problems worse. A very large number of African American young people who we talked to said that they would not, under any circumstances, call the police. And so, that should make us think about alternatives. When someone has a mental health crisis, when there are domestic concerns, there's a question about who are the appropriate, people, experts, professionals to call in that moment. And we know already the work has been done, the research has been done, and it's very clear that, that police officers don't feel, and in many cases are not well equipped to handle these issues. And then when it comes to actual, issues around, there was a shooting, there was an assault. The report also made clear that police officers don't respond appropriately to that, and so there's a question, I think, on both ends about one, the fact that police officers in a number of instances should not be the first point of contact, and two, sort of the fundamentals of their job or their mandate, they're not fulfilling that, and so there's a question about sort of the need for alternatives for justice. Yeah.
So let me just jump in quickly and just say I agree, of course, with everything David just said. And I think, there is an answer that says, what should we tell the police? And we should tell them, you need better training, you shouldn't come to certain neighborhoods, you can't handle mental health. But then there's the larger question about this kind of systemic nature of disinvestment in largely communities of color, and that no kind of attention to the police will fix that problem, right? And without attention to that kind of larger systemic issue, then in fact, we're never going to kind of get to a point where we can say, oh, if we can just fix the police. Because maybe if we invest in those communities, disinvest in policing, then we need the police less. Like, when activists think about kind of questions of abolition, they're saying, in fact, we have to change the framework through which we kind of deal with and think about issues of policing.
As China's role grows greater on the global stage, you want to stay up to date on the issues most pressing to China both domestically and internationally. Check out the Just China podcast for in-depth analysis on recent headlines and investigative reports on Chinese matters that affect our globalized world. We are Just China. Find us on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you enjoy your podcast listening.
Next, we also wanted to ask about the section that focused on political inequalities and how young people think differently about political institutions in Chicago. Something I was very struck by was just the different listings of the issues that individuals found most important based on neighborhood, how that really varied for Pilsen, Inglewood, Chinatown, Bridgeport, and the North Side. Can you speak a little bit to just a general overview of what you found from speaking with young people about this, and why do you think that there is such a disparity in terms of what issues they find to be most significant in their lives?
Yeah. So I think, this is probably maybe most illustrative of the significance of place, right? Race and place. Because while some would say, okay, what's the political agenda of young people, or what do millennials care about? And what we do in all of our work, both with the survey and with this qualitative work, is try to say that there's no kind of monolithic generation or group, and that we have to kind of really root people in where they live, their experiences as a kind of racial and gendered and sexual subjects and citizens. And I think our work around political inequalities makes it clear. So when we ask young people, what's the biggest issue confronting your community, we got what we get also at the national level is real variation. So for Pilsen, young people talk about gentrification. They talk about developers coming in, buying land, that taxes go up, and the people who have lived in that community and really made that community can no longer either afford to live there, or often they can't afford to kind of go to the restaurants that are now kind of populating the city. So for them, gentrification was an issue. For young folks in Inglewood, it was violence, but it wasn't just a kind of simple equation of, there are too many shootings. It is the representation of violence in our neighborhood. It is the ways in which the police respond to violence in the neighborhood. The fact that there's no nuance in thinking about violence in our neighborhoods, right? Like a number of the young people, and David can speak to this, would say that I feel safe in my neighborhood for the most part. However, there's a representation that my neighborhood and the people that I've grown up with aren't safe. And there aren't real strategies, effective strategies that engage with community-based organizations to make the neighborhood safer. In Chinatown, Bridgeport, we heard young people saying that, in fact, we need more schools in our neighborhoods. We need a high school. We need selective enrollment. I don't want to have to leave my neighborhood, right, to get the type of quality education that, in fact, I want and I think our community demands. And on the North Side, it wasn't violence. It was guns and crime and the fear of being robbed or having people come to the north, to invade the North Side. You want to say something? Yeah, yes.
I just think it's interesting because that kind of lines up with, I feel like throughout the report, there are kind of these references to the white North Siders being interviewed who seem very aware of what is going on in other parts of the city, but they're so disconnected from it. Yeah. So I feel like this is just kind of epitomizes that. Like the issue isn't the experience of people who are living with that violence every day, but how do we think about guns? How do we think about this from a kind of maybe a less personal perspective?
No, absolutely. Really, and then I'm going to let David, I know, who wants to probably jump in, but I was going to say, you have to remind people sometimes when we're talking to them, we're talking about young people who supposedly all live in the same city, but have very distinct experiences. And so even something like, people talk about, oh my God, the violence in Chicago, that manifests itself very differently on the South and the West Sides and the North Sides in terms of what people care about. And so when we talk about what's going to be the response to violence, what people want varies by where they live in the city. And hopefully the report begins to shed some light on that and begins to say, okay, who's going to be allowed to craft, as you might ask, the policies in response to a crisis like violence, right? Whose voices will we listen to and who will we respond to?
I would just, I guess, add as an illustration, it was interesting because one question we asked was, do you think Chicago is a violent city, right? And we asked that to all respondents, and we had a very, very different response from young whites and young Asian Americans as opposed to young Latinx and young African Americans. So those, and so young African Americans in particular, and also young Latinx to an extent, had much closer and much more proximate experience of violence, and they were much more likely to really complicate this idea that Chicago's a violent city. They pushed against that. They said, well, actually, no, Chicago's not a violent city. there's areas, there's intersections, there's blocks, there's a way that people can respond that is violent. But Chicago is not itself a violent city.